Hello, we are live for American Spirits episode 13, where I am once again joined by Ryan Turnipseed. Hello, Ryan, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you doing?
Good. Hopefully, good, because we were just streaming to the test channel a few minutes ago, and now we're actually live. And then, of course, we've got Mr. Auberon Quinn with us. How are you?
I am very well. I am excited to talk about some Confederation.
Cool. All right. I have now muted the Entropy stream. I am hosting again, by the way. I am now producing the show, so bear with me for just a second. So yeah, let me chime in chat if any of the three of us are not audible, or just chime in if we're all audible, please. Anyway, we are covering Merrill Jensen's book for the last time on these streams, probably. We've done 4 episodes on Jensen now, which is quite a lot. Two on his first book on the Articles of Confederation period of the United States, and now we're reading and discussing his second book titled The New Nation on the same period, or rather the period of the Confederation itself. Of course, the previous book was the lead up to the Confederation. So we're going to finish this topic for this week and then move on to something else, which I'm sure the audience is quite ready for. But this is an important period in American history. So with that, why don't we get right into it? Who would like to bring the first topic up? I think, Mr. Quinn, perhaps you have some of the earliest content in the book.
Yeah, sure. We can talk. I'm historiography. So what happened was basically, if we want to go to page 185, 186 of the book, Charlie, um, following the end of the hostilities, suddenly British merchants could trade with the United States again, and they were extremely eager to do so. They lobbied Parliament for the right to essentially continue to trade with the United States as if it were still a part of the empire. They wanted free trade, they wanted free access from their side. And then on the American side, during the war, European goods became extremely scarce, especially luxury goods became very dear. And so there was a massive pent up demand, which these British merchants were very eager to satisfy. So no sooner had the guns fallen silent than shiploads, I believe 28 ships went into Boston in 1782, after in the last 4 months after the war was over, just deluging the now United States markets, not the colonial markets, with this influx of British goods. And pay for these goods, these British merchants also extended gushes and gushes of British credit to Americans to buy the goods that the British were importing. This resulted initially in a tremendous economic boom. And on page 185 at the bottom, he says, these goods came to markets adequately, if not oversupplied. Credit and easy terms were offered American merchants to induce them to buy. They bought, and they bought too much. In turn, they sold to people on credit and sold them too much. Mechanics were reported to be buying silk stockings, and farmers' daughters buying silks. It is little wonder, then, that the rugged old Puritans thought the world was coming to no good end. And so we have this initial, 4 or 5 months following the revolution, we have an enormous economic boom. And Ryan, what does that predict?
Well, especially because the preceding years were extremely inflationary on both sides of the war, that means that we're about to have a bust or a contraction period because this is unnatural.
And lo, we did. On page 188, Jensen writes, um, if I can find it here, sorry. Um, by the summer of 1784, people were asking themselves what had happened, why it had happened, and what they could do about it. Like other men in other depressions, from the beginning of time to the present day, few blamed either their own greed or stupidity. Some said the government was to blame, it should keep out the British. But at once there was wrangling, for the merchants wanted to keep out only their British competitors, not British goods, while mechanics, I'm sorry, I'm getting some echo. I'm trying to figure out where it's coming from. Apologies. But once there was wrangling, for the merchants wanted to keep out not only their only their British competitors, not British goods, while the mechanics, the budding manufacturers, wanted to keep out British goods as well. Others blamed the women for all the extravagances, and this was a popular idea. In an article printed in Boston, but picked up and printed with relish by New York and Philadelphia newspapers, it was announced that commerce had extended her blessings over us in a way unprecedented. Foreign productions were low priced, but they were superfluities, and everyone possessed of Republican principles should feel anxious at the vast quantity of specie leaving the continent daily to pay for these baubles. The quote unquote fair Americans should exercise self denial. They should dispense with that ostentatious pageantry so much now in vogue, since such things are calculated to give fashionable grace only to those in want of beauty. For, and it lapses into verse here, the beauteous female, unadorned and plain, secure to please while youth confirms her reign, slights every borrowed charm that dress supplies, nor shares with art the triumph of her eyes. Very elusive.
Yeah, so we can see why that would be an appealing reasoning for the economic problems of the United States at the problem at the time. Just to highlight some of the debt, I will read some figures he cites later in the book, way back in or way forward in the section 300 or section 5, page 382. Let's see. Perhaps 400 million in paper money, quartermaster, and commissary certificates of the central government, and equally great sums that had been issued by the states had been wiped out by the middle of 1783. The remaining war debt was small by comparison, although its political significance was enormous. So that was where the debt started, and then it was paid off to a significant extent. Here we go. In May 1788, the foreign debt of the United States was estimated at $10 million, roughly. This included money borrowed from the French and Spanish governments, the farmers general of France, and the bankers of Holland. The foreign debt grew rapidly during the Confederation, so that gives us an idea of how much debt we're actually talking about here.
Indeed. And in addition to debt, there's another dimension of this. In the quote I just read, there's one remark about a, quote, vast quantity of specie leaving the continent daily to pay for these baubles. Ryan, do you want to explain what specie refers to?
Yeah, right. So in this case, because we're leaving the sort of fiat paper system that had existed during the war, and we're trying to go back to a traditional monetary system. Specie here refers to precious metals, gold in particular, such that your bills, the notes that you have, can be exchanged for that amount of specie, whether you be the government, a person, or whatnot else. And so this is actually very important this is the extent of the economics I'm ever going to go into on this channel, I hope. A lot of people now try to create these sort of protectionist arguments in the modern day by appealing to old-style protectionist and thinkers from this era that we're talking about. Keeping the specie in the country was the main program of the mercantilist factions, and was a main goal of protectionist tariffs at this point in time. There were new budding arguments that I'm sure we're about to talk about for spurring new industries, especially in this new independent country. But the main idea was that the more gold or the more specie that we had in the country, the less that it was being exsanguinated or sent out to other countries, the better off the country would be, the wealthier it would be, the more powerful it would be. This is hard for the modern mind to understand because we don't really have this monetary system anymore, and a lot of these arguments for protection don't make sense. But it's worth pointing out here, and I'm glad that you made note of it. That this is a sort of, it's not necessarily a security argument, though it could easily become one. But it was a massive issue monetarily, that we had a lot of gold leaving the country, and we were getting, as the text posited, a bunch of baubles and other small items.
Especially because the people to whom debts were owed wanted those debts paid in specie rather than legacy paper money or any other sort of certificates if possible. So the specie leaving the country is, that many less coins that they could potentially be paid in, because everyone is scrambling to ensure that their debts are settled or their speculations rewarded as soon as possible, as the revolution comes to an end and government begins.
And as we've discussed in previous streams, this lack of specie, this lack of hard money, this lack of cash to actually spend in your day-to-day life would plague the rural areas of the country throughout the entire colonial period. We've discussed that in previous streams. But now this sudden outflow of cash to Europe and to Britain in particular has now reached the point where this shortages are becoming acute in the towns. They're feeling this in Boston, they're feeling this in Philadelphia, so it's not just a rural issue anymore.
Right, and something else to point out as well, just in case it was cut off at the beginning, is the point of all of this is to illustrate that we were not some backwater or backwards economic nation during the Confederation period, which is something that I actually got in school, and it's a myth that still pervades to this day. And just from what we've been talking about so far, like, look at it. We already have our own business cycles, concerns about specie, and whatnot else. Like, this is very advanced at the time.
Yeah, and another reason this is such an acute problem in 1783 is that for the previous several years, there'd been very little in the way of harvests. Traditionally, how the colonial economy had worked was Americans would ship raw materials, in particular crops, to Europe in return for European goods, and so it was possible to balance the trade. But because in 1782 and 1781 there were armies marching through all the fields, the crop yields were extremely limited, and so there was nothing to export in 1783 to balance the trade, and so it created this tremendous trade deficit of America importing things for cash rather than importing things for goods.
You had another thing I saw you reference, which was the economic intervention point, which is that everyone in the country expected the government to intervene economically on their behalf. There were no economic libertarians at this time.
No, indeed. The manufacturers wanted tariffs to protect them. The merchants didn't want tariffs. They did want preference for American ships. It was a practice at the time that if goods came in on a British ship, they would be taxed at one rate. If they came in on an American ship, they'd be taxed at a more preferential rate. The countryside people didn't care at all about either of those things, and they wanted debt relief, and they wanted their taxes lowered. And so on page 193, we have this concluding paragraph kind of summing up the situation. It is a striking fact that most Americans in the 18th century agreed that government should intervene in economic life. They disagreed only as to the nature of the intervention and as to which groups were to benefit thereby. The history of conflict among the various groups in American society in their demands for state aid lends richness and variety to the history of state politics during the 1780s. Moreover, it throws new light on the factors involved in the movement for a stronger central government, as do the following chapters on the roots of recovery.
Now, on page 213, you had something you wanted to read on.
Yeah, so let me lead this up. So prior to the Revolution, the colonies traded primarily with the British. This could be either with Great Britain directly. There was also a very heavy trade with the West Indies, which were under British control at the time. And one of the great opportunities that American merchants sought for themselves in fomenting the Revolution and then seized to to exploit once the revolution was accomplished was to trade with other countries. Previously been the case that American tobacco, for instance, is one that's talked about a lot, would go to Britain, but 4/5 of the tobacco that went to Britain, the British then would resell to Europe. In fact, the largest American trade good going to France was tobacco. Again, Germany, a lot of American tobacco ended up there. And the American merchants no longer saw any reason to pay British middlemen, so they would start going direct. So they went to the Dutch, they went to the French, and they set up these trading concessions to allow them to trade direct. And at the head of this movement was one Robert Morris. Robert Morris, in addition to being a tobacco king, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think the modern tobacco giant Philip Morris has its genesis in his fortune. But he was one of the 18th century's most able merchants. And reading here from page 213, Robert Morris, one of the 18th century's most able merchants, sang the credo of the merchant when he declared, quote, a merchant a merchant as such can be attached particularly to no country. His mere place of residence is, as merchant, perfectly accidental. So I thought that was a remarkably candid insight into the mind of the merchant class, not just in the American society of the 1780s, but of the merchant class always, and in all places and times.
It's very good that we got a quote directly from the merchants at this time period to buttress everything we've been saying about them for the last 3 episodes on ginseng.
Indeed, he really kind of sums it up. And then the other interesting thing, as I said, we decided to start trading heavily with the Dutch and the French, but we also, for the first time, opened up our trade to the Orient. American merchants, especially Massachusetts merchants, were extremely interested in trading with China and with India. And one of the classic problems in that age of trading with China was China didn't really want anything that we were selling. Most famously, the Opium Wars were generated because the Chinese refused to buy British goods, and so the British started forcibly importing opium to pay for tea, so that all their specie, which had previously been flowing to Peking, could stay in their country. So they were seeking a way to balance their trade deficit. America had an interesting advantage in the 18th century in that America did have a commodity that the Chinese wanted, and that was ginseng. You can grow ginseng in America, and the Chinese believed that ginseng, instilled vitality and youth in the elderly, and so there was quite a strong demand for ginseng in China, and New England merchants rushed to fill this gap right after the Revolution. I think in 1787 was when they got the first ship there. It was not a small feat getting a schooner from Boston to China, as you may imagine, in the age of sail, but they finally managed it and reaped just spectacular profits. I believe there was one instance where a ship with $1,000 worth of ginseng came back with $12,000 in cash based on one voyage. So it was a tremendous profit opportunity. And while we won't talk about it much more than that in this book, I did want to mention it because it is going to become very important in future books that we will discuss down the line when we talk about the China trade and the American relationship with China. But this is kind of where it begins.
So, contrary to the usual narrative, it seems like the U.S. was not in some dire economic straits during this time period.
No, you had a classic Austrian predicted depression in the wake of a credit-fueled boom, and then in the absence of foolish things like the New Deal, the economy stabilized quickly, and both commerce and industry would go on to flourish. Are we ready to move on to industry? Or do we have anything else to say about commerce?
No, we can move on to industry for sure.
Okay, so I keep calling them the colonists. They're not colonists anymore at this point. They're Americans, but the Americans, basically put industry and trade in two different categories, perhaps even more strongly than we do today. We maybe lump them in as business or as GDP today, but they were two very different spheres. You had the mechanics and the manufacturers who made things, and these started out as small cottage artisans who would move up to factories. And then you had the merchants who put things on ships and took them places and sold them to people. So it was two different spheres and two very different political interest groups at this time, during the time of the Confederation. And as the merchants were eventually prospering after the brief depression of 1783, the manufacturers were absolutely going gangbusters. In fact, even before this, during the war, naturally, British manufactured goods were not available. And so the domestic manufacturers of America enjoyed total protection from foreign competition, as well as immense demand, particularly for soldiers' uniforms and for iron goods, for reasons which should be obvious. And so America built out massive iron works. They built out huge numbers of mills. These mills would be water mills. At one point, there was a 5-mile stretch of the Brandywine Creek in Delaware, which had 60 mills on it, just churning out fabric. And this was all given initial impetus by the war, but then following the war, this would only accelerate, and American manufacturers would put out tremendous amounts of goods. And if I can find, okay, so on page 292. The interest schemes, the hopes of the future, and aid by state governments after the Revolution combined to bring out a rapid expansion of American manufacturing. Within 10 years after the Revolution, Brandywine Creek had about 60 mills along 7 or 8 miles of its course through Delaware. Household production of cloth was such that the state of New Jersey had 41 fulling mills at a time when there were no manufactories of cloth in the state. So this is just people spinning cloth at home and then bringing it to these mills for fulling. A few years after the Revolution, a shop in Philadelphia sold 1,500 sets of spinning wheel irons in a single year. Manufacturing spread rapidly to the frontier. By 1790, the people of Kentucky were producing a greater variety of things than the people of New York had done in 1765, which, if you realize the state of Kentucky in the colonial period as the absolute frontier, was the backwater of the backwater. By 1790, it's outproducing 1765 New York. That is a staggering leap in manufacturing capacity. By 1790, American paper mills, developed to supply the rapid increase of newspapers and magazines, were supplying most of the American market. Glassmaking was firmly established as an American industry. In fact, so substantial was the general increase that Pennsylvania alone was reported to be taking the place of Great Britain in supplying the need for manufactured goods in the southern states.
It's worth mentioning here, especially why this is suddenly taking off post-independence, and that's because a great deal of British policy towards the colonies was to make sure that the colonies only extracted raw resources and did not manufacture. The fact that there was a merchant class in the colonies that specialized in finance and trade was something that they had to begrudgingly accept due to the influence that they wielded. So this is an instance where it seems that industrialization is a sort of a policy or lack thereof, rather than a magical leap in technology, like video games and whatever else present it. It's you can actually see here two things spurring, or three things really. Number one, after an inflationary period, you would expect at this point in time large manufacturing projects to take root, but that doesn't explain their persistence fully, just because they continue to grow even during the correction. So something else is happening. We had the initial protection during the war, as the book said, which would function similarly. It gets things off the ground, if not overexpands them, but once again, they still profitably grow after the protection is gone, or at least lessened. It really is. It causes one to wonder how stunted the colonies were under British restrictions, such that right now they just start to blow up as soon as they're lifted.
Yeah, and on the subject of restrictions, they don't cover it in this book, but it is a fact that Parliament actually outlawed the export to the colonies of any kind of machinery any kind of technology that was all carefully kept on the British island. And there are several stories in history of various inventors basically becoming fugitives and smuggling themselves to the colonies in order to practice their trade there.
Yeah, so I think this is actually summarized really well the information the listeners need to comprehend the sort of economic state of the country right after the revolution. So to the extent any of us have been taught about this period, there was certainly no particularly high degree of, or any real degree at all, of economic chaos. In fact, the problem started to be solved very quickly when the revolution closed and the Congress made substantial strides in paying off the national debt as well and attending to other important matters. There was no sense in which there was deadlock. There was really no core issue stopping the recovery and economic development of the United States. Certainly, the nationalists in Congress wanted the Congress to be sovereign over the states, primarily for forging, their own view of a national destiny, rather than these, we could say, different separate destinies of the individual states. That's just a matter of historical perspective, which way you lean on that. But certainly, we can say that the Confederation was not some massive disaster period. Anyway, why don't we move on to some of the things I have prepared? Let's see. I will bring, unless I don't know if you had anything, Ryan, that you.
I mean, just one other point I'd point out here. It's not central to the theme, but the point about Pennsylvania being the principal exporter to the southern states is another structural issue that will raise its head in later periods of American history. You have this beginning of northern predominance in industry, while the South remains relatively agrarian. All the places we just heard about, Delaware, New York, Pennsylvania, these are all obviously north of the Mason-Dixon line. And so at this early stage, you're seeing that bifurcation in economies, which would have so much impact later on.
The only points that I would make, because if I remember, and you can stop me if this isn't the case, we're about to go into the more cultural, societal aspects of things. The only things that I would really want to cover in between that are somewhat similar. There's this sort of meme idea that the Articles of Confederation, or the government under the Articles of Confederation, could not administer the land or the amount of territory that was granted to us after the war closed, which is completely false. Especially if even mainstream historians recognize that one of the main achievements of the Articles of Confederation, or at least under the Articles of Confederation, was the process laid down for incorporating territories into the country, with the various ordinances that were passed dealing with administering the West. And I, in fact, still see this to this very day from a lot of pop history types that get many more views than we do, into the hundreds of thousands of views, thinking that because the Articles of Confederation existed, if it were to have persisted, then Virginia would be this behemoth state, and there would just be a complete mismanaging of the West. Completely ignores any of the ordinances that were passed in the mid to late 1780s under the Confederation. So that's the sort of first myth that I don't know that we really need to go into all that much, because it's self-explanatory and in a sense mainstream. I don't think I need to teach people what the Northwest Ordinance was. But the other thing to keep well, if I need to give the most basic explanation, it laid out the rights of the people in the territories, and it laid out the mechanism by which they could join the Union. These territories turning states. It's a very nascent system to what we have today, which is much more elaborate with different categories. So, contrary to still persisting mythology, the Confederate government could administer the land out west, and did actually solve the problem that normal people look at when they see the map and think, how on earth would this work? They did actually solve the problem of gigantic states just extending perpetually westward. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out as well, and this is something that Jensen really speaks a lot, probably due to the historical era that Jensen was coming out of. Something that he views as an achievement of the Confederate Congress was that it established a bureaucracy that functioned well. So this is something else to keep in mind. People that try to argue for the Constitution by belittling the Confederate Congress as helpless or worthless, unable to govern, kind of tell a falsehood here, just because the Congress actually did establish a bureaucracy that was able to conduct foreign affairs as well as different tasks that it was actually given the jurisdiction over within the country. So these are just two things to note. I don't think we need to go into overly much detail, but the government actually did function. It was not like a dumpster fire like everyone always gets taught, and it was much less intrusive than the government we got immediately after, which there was no massive rebellion that got put down ruthlessly under the Confederate articles. So that's all that I really had to bring up here in the meantime.
Roundhouse kick a pop historian, shove a pop historian in a dumpster, etc.
Yeah, never listened to them.
Yes, well, actually, on what you were just saying there, I do have a selection. So I wanted to just I took a few selections that just sort of summarize the big accomplishments of the Confederation, specifically in regard to Western lands and that bureaucracy. And yeah, this is an important point, that the Congress did have a functioning bureaucracy that functioned on foreign policy, on settling the war debts, and on the policy towards the West. So the actual creation of that federal bureaucracy is an accomplishment that allowed the constitutional government that followed not to be hamstrung, because George Washington's government did not come into existence out of whole cloth. I don't have this, there's a lot of detail on this, but there are some particular postings that Jensen brings up that were maintained by the same people through the Confederation to the constitutional period, and the men with those experiences, garnered them in the Confederation. So there's no sense in which it was a bureaucratic failure either. Now let me read what is on the screen here, actually, plus the paragraph beforehand. Quote, "The government of the Confederation struggled to straighten out the tangled mess that resulted from the financing of the war, and here, too, made progress. Finally, it faced the basic issue of the relationship of the balance of power between the central government and the states. That issue was before the people of the new nation from the outset of the war. After 1783, the believers in the federal system, provided by the Articles of Confederation, sought hard to solve its problems. They recognized that the central government needed more power, and they sought to acquire that power, meanwhile carefully guarding against any basic change in the nature of the Confederation." So, pausing there briefly, the people who were for the Confederation still understood that the Congress did need more power to handle the particular issues that it was facing. However, they were not seeking to fundamentally alter the sovereignty of that Congress to become sovereign over the states. Anyway, continuing. Quote, "As one views the achievements of the Confederation, it is evident that the story is not a negative one, but a story of steady striving toward a goal. The weakness of the central government under the Confederation was the weakness of any government that must achieve its ends by persuasion rather than by coercion. There was a large group of citizens of the new nation who believed in persuasion. A smaller but equally powerful group believed in a central government with coercive authority. The triumph of the latter group in the face of the achievements of the Confederation government was a victory for a dynamic minority with a positive program. It parallels in many ways the achievement of an equally dynamic but quite different minority in bringing about the war for independence and in writing the Articles of Confederation." End quote.
Wait. You're telling me there was a dynamic, possibly organized minority that managed to impose its will on the country?
Yeah, I see where you were going there. I also realized I forgot to press the button to put this quote on screen, but It doesn't matter, because the point was made. Now, and the point, of course, being, other than the elite theory thing, which is quite obvious that you just made, is that people talk about how it's a bad thing that the Confederation was weak, but that was kind of the entire point, right? The point is that the Congress was not sovereign over the states. So you can sort of label that and slur it, if you like, as weakness, if of course you're against that, but you're basically assuming the nationalist position there rather than the state sovereignty position. If your argument is that the Confederation is weak, it's weak by design, in the sense that the Congress is weak but the states are powerful. It's not that America itself was weak, and this is the crux of the argument, is that the idea of the Confederation being weak is the idea that America was weak, but that's not true. We can see that America was increasing its power substantially immediately after the Revolution, very successfully. So that's all I wanted to mention on that.
Just something else as well is for anyone that has listened to what we might also call sort of like pop elite theory or something else. Elites can actually weaken the power of specific institutions because it helps their group. All elite powered or all elite action does not have to like centralize or strengthen power. I feel like this gets conflated a lot. Where especially as it gets applied online to groups in the modern day, there's sort of like this weird idea that's emerged that because elite theory, therefore there is no decentralization, as if history is just devoid of decentralization altogether. So, something there for people that might have bought into that line of argument.
Certainly, elite theory does not require that you support or even believe that centralization is inevitable. As Jensen argues at the end of that paragraph that I now put on the screen, is that it was a minority who brought about the war in the first place, and that was a war of decentralization, a war away from the centralized power of the British government. Now, I should have read this first, but let me just transition to the preceding paragraph, because this is also important, and we might talk about this further in just a bit. Quote, "The United States acquired a vast source of future wealth as the states ceded their claims to western lands. The national domain became a fact in 1784. Between then and 1787, in 3 great ordinances, Congress laid down the basic policies that were to be used as the United States spread westward to the Pacific. At the same time, a permanent staff of government employees was built up. These men carried on the affairs of central government whether Congress was in session or not. When the Washington administration took over in 1789, the members of the new administration, in effect, moved into front offices staffed with men who for years had handled the details of foreign affairs, finance, Indian relations, the post office, and the like. Many of these employees continued to do the basic work of the central government after 1789 as they had done before. The government under the Constitution of 1787 would have been helpless without them, as the Confederation would have been, yet this bureaucracy has been an unknown to most of the people who have written off the Confederation." So, yeah, that's just sort of re-emphasizing what I said, that, when you think of the Confederation, you just think of this weak Congress, and it's ignored the fact that they had this functioning bureaucracy in place regardless of whether Congress was in session. And also the point is made here, too, that we talked about last stream the issue of Western land rights. Well, the Confederation did ultimately succeed in establishing a national domain under the Congress and getting the states to cede their land rights so that these lands could be administered under the central government, which is a major achievement. They created the West.
Yeah, an important point, and maybe you'll get to this, to make, is that this bureaucracy was built up between 1784 and 1787, i.e. before our current Constitution, but in this period, it was Congress's bureaucracy, which would not remain the case.
Yes, I don't have that selected, but that is something Jensen mentions in the book, how the executive power claimed the bureaucratic elements after the Constitution came into effect. So this is a congressional bureaucracy rather than an executive bureaucracy. And, who knows where that might have led in a sort of post-fact, not post-fact, whatever you call it, alternate version,
Counterfactual.
counterfactual, yeah. In a counterfactual version of history, I mean, who knows where that would have led? But what we do know is that the bureaucracy was directly accountable to the Congress. Would that make it more or less accountable to the voters? I mean, who knows? To explore that counterfactual is kind of, way beyond the scope of the stream. But it is interesting to make that realization of a bureaucracy under Congress rather than under, effectively, the issue we face today is the bureaucracy under the executive has become its own branch of government and has completely supplanted the executive. Would that have happened under Congress?
It's worth keeping in mind as well that because the bureaucracy was under Congress, that was a significant chunk of the Congress's time was to examine the bureaucracy, make sure that it was doing what it was supposed to do, questioning it and whatnot else. The Congress did not just exist to legislate and create new laws and whatnot, especially because as well under the Articles of Confederation, its ability to do so across the entire country or the entire Confederation was extremely limited. So there is an interesting shift in power or centralization going from the Congress to the executive, not just because of accountability or something slightly more ethereal or tangential, but just because now the Congress has more time to do other things over a national jurisdiction without as many restrictions. So this is it's worth keeping in mind as well that when you think about the Confederate Congress, it is not the Congress that we currently see today.
Yeah, well, I'll indulge in my own counterfactual speculation, but I think that having responsibility for overseeing the bureaucracy would result in a less stultified and ineffectual body than that with which we are currently blessed.
Now I wanted to call out really quick this paragraph about the West and about Thomas Jefferson, just to select a particular individual who is often credited with great things within American history. Jensen here credits Jefferson specifically with Western policy. So, quote, "The man chiefly responsible for the foundation of the first colonial policy of the United States was Thomas Jefferson. He had long been interested in the region west of the Alleghenies, not as a speculator, but as a statesman, a scientist, and a believer in agrarian democracy. Where others wanted to hand the West over to speculators, he wanted it to belong to actual settlers. Where others distrusted Westerners as banditti and wanted them ruled by military force, he wanted them to govern themselves. Thus, when he brought the Virginia Cession to Congress, he had definite ideas about what should be done. He was made chairman of a committee to draft an ordinance for the government of the new public domain. He believed that the land should be given to the settlers, for they would have to pay their share of the national debt anyway. Why should they pay double? If settlers had to pay for the lands, they would dislike the Union. Furthermore, they would settle the lands no matter what Congress did. One settler in the West would be worth 20 times what he paid for the land, and he would be worth that every year if he lived on his farm." End quote. So that bit about the national debt, actually, so the selling of Western lands is one of the major ways that the Congress was paying off the national debt. The Western lands were basically this sort of metaphorical gold mine. I guess in some cases literally, at other times in our development. But this was one way the national debt was being paid for. So of course, if people are buying the land, Jefferson's point here is why should they be then taxed again by the Congress to continue paying off the debt? Now, let me check. This was page 353. The book goes into how this resulted in the Land Ordinance of 1784, I believe, which was... Actually, I have the quote ready. Let me just go ahead and pull that up. So, quote, "It is too often said and believed that the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which repealed the Ordinance of 1784, provided for democracy in the territories of the United States. The reverse is actually true. Jefferson's ordinance provided for democratic self-government of Western territories, and for that reason it was abolished in 1787 by the land speculators and their supporters who wanted congressional control of the Wests so that their interests could be protected from the actions of the inhabitants." End quote. So here's a case where Jensen's arguing basically that the the nationalist and ultimately constitutional government is the one responsible for bringing democracy to the West, for opening the West, but it's really Jefferson's original model, the Ordinance of 1784, that actually provided for real democratic government, self-government of these territories, whereas the later ordinance brought in by the nationalists and speculators who won out on this cause, they won out, and there was actually more centralized control over the land.
It's something that's interesting as well, keeping in mind our historiography from the progressives here. They're analyzing things in terms of class interest and elites. It is quite fascinating that Jefferson would be the standard bearer for the settler, the colonist, the person out west when he was he would have stronger ties due to his class to financial interests, speculators, and whatnot else, like many other Virginia planters did at this time, George Washington being perhaps the most famous Virginia planter land speculator. It's quite something that we actually get the closest thing we can get to a true believer who kind of bucks the class interest and argues on behalf of the frontier settler.
Oh, excuse me.
It's worth noting.
Yeah, say what you will about Jefferson. He walked the walk.
Yeah, I wanted to call him out there just for it is said, I think Jensen covered this, that sort of Jefferson, betrays his own alleged values, which, he apparently has at this time, but by the time he's president, the government has changed. It's a constitutional government now, with an executive power to centralized government. So you can hardly, if you're gonna throw that allegation at Jefferson, I think it's important to at least acknowledge the times prior to that when he actually fought for the things he was, is proclaimed to have believed in.
Right, and something else that's worth mentioning here as well, since especially in our first episodes we covered that it was the movement westward that really shaped one of the foundations of the country that's indispensable. Jefferson's actions here are therefore also indispensable to the character of the country. It would be suicidal as an American to your own identity, history, and heritage to throw Jefferson out as a proto-leftist or something else like many other so-called rightists today tried to do. He's a good part of American history just for the simple fact here that he allowed the frontier to exist in the way that we got it.
Now, I think we've kind of tread on this ground a little bit, but I don't have that many screenshots, so I will just go ahead and read this from his sort of concluding chapters anyway on one of the major achievements, which is the creation of the federal bureaucracy. Quote, a second major achievement of the Confederation was the creation of a bureaucracy which carried on the day-to-day work of the central government. To talk of the Confederation government in terms only of Congress, of its difficulties in doing business, the failure of some of the states to be fully represented, is to tell a distorted story, for the government continued to function whether Congress met or not. Congress was primarily a policy-making, not an administrative body, although administrative officers were elected by and responsible to it. This practice was reversed after 1789, when administrative officers were made responsible to the executive rather than to the legislature. The creation of a responsible staff of civil servants by the Confederation government is an almost unknown story. These men carried on the work of the Departments of War, Foreign Affairs, Finance, and the Post Office in season and out. Many of them continued to be employed after 1789. The best example of this was Joseph Norse of Virginia, who became Register of the Treasury in 1779, a post which he held until 1829, when he retired because of old age. He kept books and prepared innumerable reports for Robert Morris, the Board of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, and the secretaries of the Treasury who followed him. If it had not been for Norse and men like him with years of practical experience in the day-to-day affairs of government behind them, the Washington administration would have been badly hampered. End quote. And then I have from page 388 the dealing with the federal debt, or the war debts rather. Now, yeah, I'll just go ahead and quote this, and then we can discuss. Quote, However, the rough balance sheet of the Confederation does show certain positive things. It showed that the new nation had a cash income from the states, that it had sound credit with Dutch bankers, that it paid most of the interest on the foreign debt and part of the interest on the domestic debt, and finally, that it had arrived at a position where it could begin to pay the principal as well as the interest on the domestic debt through the sale of Western lands. It was deficit financing, of course, but it can be argued that the Confederation perhaps came as close to making means match needs as many a 20th century government has been able to do. These have kept going by enormous increases in national debts, whereas the Confederation actually managed to reduce the principal of its debt. Its methods were not sound finance by modern standards, but we have yet to see how sound the national debts of the 20th century will be. The lack of the lack of an independent income was the great political as well as the great economic weakness of the Confederation government. The lack, perhaps more than any other single fact, brought about its downfall. If the government had been able to acquire an income of its own, the strongest argument against it would have been shattered. Even so, the problem of the national debt was being solved in a different fashion. One state after another during the Confederation assumed the national debt owned by its citizens. This process was the result of the joint pressure of public creditors who demanded better returns on their holdings, and of course politicians who feared that national payment of the debt would mean a powerful central government. End quote.
Yeah, that's something we kind of glossed over, this assumption of the national debt by the individual states. Part of the settlement was that, instead of treating the national debt as national, each state took its share and was responsible for it.
Yeah, and this is really important. The states took these debts on at different times and under different expectations and conditions, but I believe we covered this last stream, how the issue of who was going to pay all this debt was a major one. And of course, the nationalists wanted the debt to be assumed by the central government because this national debt that the country would be universally responsible for would be something that would glue the nation together. So the fact that this was able to be negotiated under the Confederation was, of course, a major achievement. The payment of the debt was not deadlocked, as the paragraph preceding describes. The principal was actually being paid off. And of course, we have the issue here of the lack of income of Congress, which, due to its limited abilities to collect any income whatsoever, the Jensen believes that this was the major reason why the Confederation was able to be defeated by the Constitution. There were attempts, of course, and we're not going to go through all these in detail, but this was a known problem. And the people who supported the Confederation were trying to solve this problem. And if the Constitution didn't effectively coup the Confederation within a few short years, it's likely they would have come up with some sort of solution for Congress to have an actual income that would allow it to become a more effective part of a central government rather than a central national government. So this was a problem that was being addressed.
Gentlemen,
right, and it's also... Go on.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say as well, it also shows that even though Congress had limited ability to collect revenues, that limitation imposed on it a different way of financing debt, specifically selling land, instead of just resorting to taxes like immediately happened after we got the Constitution, of which the fact that we now had revenue is used to further expand expenditures, or it was used as an argument to do that. I find it interesting, the main argument that moderns usually have is they look at the part of the Articles of Confederation that prohibit the Congress from imposing a tax on all the states. The states would have to willingly give revenues to the Congress should the state choose to. They take that and then assume, without actually looking at the history, that therefore the Congress must have just never received any money whatsoever and was unable to pay for anything, when in actuality that's not the case. As you were saying, they were managing to pay off some of the debt that it had. So it's I think there's a very the mainstream history of this period, which many people receive and still repeat to this day, kind of argues a priori. They look at the articles and see that there's a weak central government, and because there's a weak central government, therefore the debt must have been terrible, and there must have just been deadlock regarding financial matters. But the actual evidence, the history, shows otherwise.
Yeah, that's a good point about taxes. One can imagine which way you would prefer it. Of course, the collection of taxes did give the Congress money, and then it just increased its spending even further and went further into deficit financing. As far as the earlier point about how the debts of the 20th century will work out, well, yeah, I think it's pretty obvious that the experiment has not gone very well for the common American.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let me bring up the last thing I have, which is this section from page 423. Wow. Okay, I thought this PDF had underlined the same thing my copy of the book has, but the previous owners underlined different things. That was just weirding me out. So, quote, "To say that many of the pessimistic traditions are false is not to say that all Americans were peaceful and satisfied. The holders of national and state debts wanted bigger payments than they got. The merchants wanted more government aid than was given them. The farmers, hit by high taxes and rigid collection of both taxes and private debts, demanded relief in the form of lower taxes and government loans from state legislatures. Such demands kept state politics in an uproar during the 1780s. However, the often violent expression of such discontents in politics should not blind us to the fact that the period was one of extraordinary economic growth. Merchants owned more ships at the end of the 1780s than they had at the beginning of the Revolution, and they carried a greater share of American produce. By 1790, the export of agricultural produce was double what it had been before the war. American cities grew rapidly, with the result that housing was scarce and building booms produced a labor shortage. Tens of thousands of farmers spread outwards to the frontiers. There can be no question but that freedom from the British Empire resulted in a surge of activity in all phases of American life. Of course, not all the problems of the new nation were solved by 1789. All have not yet been solved, but there is no evidence of stagnation and decay in the 1780s. Instead, the story is one of a newly free people who seized upon every means to improve and enrich themselves in a nation which they believed had a golden destiny." End quote. So yeah, I think that is a really good summary of the whole period. You can argue, as backers of the Constitution would, that the Confederation hadn't solved all problems by the year 1787. Just sort of picking this arbitrary period. While the Articles of Confederation didn't solve everything, well, the constitutional government didn't solve everything either. And as Jensen points out, some of the problems still exist, even when he wrote the book in the 1950s.
And more exacerbated since.
Yeah, many such cases. So yeah, overall, I wanted to keep this one relatively short, just because we've been talking about the Confederation. I think we've kind of beaten this horse to death now. And unfortunately, the Confederation itself was beaten to death by the Constitution. But I think the viewers have a pretty solid foundation for the period now. Let's see if we have any super chats. Of course, you guys can add anything else as well. I'm just going to check those.
I'll just take this time to announce that in the interests of promoting stream cohesion and binding the three of us together in a more perfect union, I have taken out an American Spirits credit card, for which you both are also responsible.
Wonderful. I'm sure we can Prussianize the stream to make sure that we all adhere into a nice corporate entity. Something else, something that if we want to summarize everything we've been over here, I think it would be worth sort of highlighting this era as a forgotten golden age, because we've already talked about there was a massive economic expansion, cultural expansion that wasn't forced from the top down, as well as we mentioned last stream. Just we actually had men of letters, learned men, men of culture, and men of science as well, that managed to develop our culture and actually make an American identity. without the need for that to be imposed by the army, as some founding fathers were suggesting. So the economy was good, science was good, the culture was good. And something else is that it was actually true to the principles that founded the country and the revolution during this period. So there wasn't there was no sort of counter-revolutionary contradiction to resolve. I think that this is grounds for being a sort of a forgotten golden age.
Mm.
Well put. I should mention too that the assumption of debt by the states did result in problems, particularly for the South, as Jensen points out. But again, this was very much a reaction to the fear of the nationalist program as a way to resolve the issue without bringing that debt under the central government. And there's as that other paragraph I had read describes, I mean, everyone wanted lots of things from the federal government at this time. No one was completely satisfied, but that's simply the reality of putting an entirely brand new country together. Let me read the super chats. Christopher Burks for $2 just sends us a salute. Thank you very much. And then Dawn Browning sends us 20 Australian dollars of an anthropomorphic lemon, which seems to be repeatedly hugging some small blue fruit, which could be an apple, and yet it is blue. So maybe that's green, and my phone is just in blue light mode. So maybe he's hugging a little apple or something, or a peach. Who knows? But I'm glad the fruits are, having a great time, and we really appreciate the donations and the super stickers. And speaking of fruit, Melon sends us $15 for Roundhouse Kick a Pop Historian. Yeah, that was actually really funny. I was muted when I think when you had said that, but yeah, pop historians need to be roundhouse kicked and cut in half by katanas because they don't know what they're talking about usually. Now, I think that about covers it. So, did I miss anything? No, that was all the super chats. Let's see, things to shill. I will be. I've been streaming on my gaming channel a bit, my secret gaming channel. I'll go ahead and drop it in the chat. I'm doing that during the D spaces. Just so people have something to look at if they are tuning into Mr. D's Twitter Spaces. So I'll drop the link to my secret channel in the chat. As far as what we're going to be doing in this podcast, next week we are doing something a little different. Again, we're going to be looking at a book I've actually read I think 2 years ago, because this was basically the primary source I used for the speech I gave at the Old Glory Club conference, not this year, but the previous year in 2024. It is titled The Meaning of the Separation of Powers, an analysis of the doctrine from its origin to the adoption of the United States Constitution by W.B. Gwynn of the Department of Political Science at Tulane University, New Orleans, written in 1965. So you might be able to find a PDF of this. I think I may have the only physical copy that you could buy on the internet. This was really difficult to acquire, but this will get into some of the philosophical foundations of the forms of government we've been talking about. And then, of course, after we read this sort of deep dive into Anglo-American legal theory, governmental theory, we will then read Charles Beard's book, An Economic History of the Constitution of the United States, I believe is the title. And we'll probably do that for 2 weeks. Beard, of course, is the arch-progressive historian, so he's also going to take a very economic, very class view of history, sort of as Jensen's done. And after that, we will quit the progressives for a while and move on to other topics, starting with something a little bit more contemporary. I I think, the first week of November. Ryan, if you want to announce that title.
Yes, we will be covering Murray Rothbard's primary history, The Betrayal of the American Right, which tracks the ideological and personal shifts in the American right from the post-war, right after World War II, all the way up until about the 70s or the 80s, give or take, tracking the decline of what's called the Old Right, which was the conservative coalition, basically, that deposed FDR. And its replacement with Bill Buckley's National Review and other such fellow travelers. So that's what the subject's going to be. Should we announce more, or is that good
Let's
enough
announce
for now?
one of the guests. Who's our first special guest from Old Glory Club?
You better
Well,
not. Huh?
yeah. So our special guest for that week from the Old Glory Club is going to be Mr. Peter Quinonias, which I'm very excited for. This is going to be a very fun stream, but that's one special guest.
Yeah, so
Which
we'll announce the other one as we get closer.
yes, yeah.
All right, so viewers should have a good idea of what we're going to be covering, and if they want to read it, you now have plenty of time to do that. Mr. Quinn, anything you would like to add before we sign off?
Nope. Thank you for having me on. It has ever been a delight, and I can't believe we've actually finished the stream on time for once.
Yeah.
Did we mention Mr. Paul Lunsford's $20 provided in chat for us? Was that Did I miss that?
Yeah, I wasn't looking. It just came in. Yeah, Paul Lunsford for $19.99. Tuning in late, but want to give respect. We respect your $20 minus 1 penny, Mr. Lunsford. We definitely appreciate the donations here, as a lot goes into these streams. So,